Part 2. The Generous Offer. 3 months passed after the Starborn Vigil's refusal, and the Dominion of Aethara did exactly what Laura Beckett said it would. It came back. But this time, it came bigger. High Chancellor Varentis was not the kind of leader who panicked. He had ruled the Dominion for 3 centuries, and he had handled rebellions, plagues, and border wars without ever losing sleep. But the human refusal bothered him in a way he could not explain. It was not anger, it was confusion. In his entire life, he had never encountered a problem that generosity could not solve. Every species wanted something. Every species had a price. The trick was simply finding it. So he assembled the fightest team the Dominion had ever sent to a single world. Cultural advisors who had studied 10,000 alien societies. Economists who could restructure a planet's entire financial system in a week. Military liaisons who could demonstrate the Dominion's protective power without firing a shot. And at the head of them all, he placed Liaison Director Kesa Mal. Kesa was a specialist in what the Dominion politely called reluctant integrations. She was small, sharp-eyed, with dark green skin and a mind that worked like a blade. She had talked dozens of hesitant species into joining the Dominion, not through threats, but through patience and persuasion. She had never failed. The delegation arrived in the Sol system aboard the Radiance of Unity, the most prestigious diplomatic vessel in the Dominion's fleet. It was a ship designed to inspire awe. Its hull was layered with living crystal that shifted colors with the light of whatever star it orbited. When it entered orbit above Earth, half the planet stopped to look up at the sky. On the ground, humanity sent its own representatives to meet them. Secretary of External Affairs Greg Nolan was a heavy-set man with thinning hair and a face that always looked like he had just heard a bad joke. Before politics, he had spent 20 years hauling cargo between colony worlds. He spoke plainly, he thought plainly, and he had absolutely no patience for anything that sounded like a sales pitch. Beside him stood Admiral Vicky Saunders, the head of the Human Defense Fleet. She was a quiet woman with sharp gray eyes and a reputation for never saying a word more than necessary. She did not smile when the Dominion shuttle landed. She did not smile at all. The meeting took place in Geneva, in a conference hall that had hosted human diplomacy for centuries. Kesa Mal walked in with her team, and for the next 3 hours, she gave the most impressive presentation any human had ever seen. She showed them technology that could let humans talk to their farthest colonies in real time. No delays, no signal loss. She offered medical breakthroughs that could push the human lifespan past 400 years. She presented atmospheric processors that could turn dead worlds into green ones in a single generation. She laid out trade agreements that would connect humanity to a galactic economy so vast that Earth's entire output was a rounding error. And she did it all with warmth, with respect, and with a genuine belief that she was offering something wonderful. When she finished, the room was quiet. Every human in the hall understood what was on the table. It was, without any exaggeration, the most valuable offer any civilization had ever made to another. Greg Nolan leaned back in his chair. He scratched the side of his nose. He looked at Kesa Mal with an expression that was not hostile, not cold, but simply settled. "That is a very kind offer," he said, "but we still have to say no." She had prepared for anger, for greed, for fear, for every possible negotiating tactic she had ever encountered. She had not prepared for a man who looked like he had already made up his mind before she walked through the door. "Secretary Nolan," she said carefully, "may I ask what it is that humanity wants? If our offer is not sufficient, we are prepared to adjust. Name your terms." Greg shook his head. "It is not about terms, Director. We do not want to be part of anyone else's empire. Not for technology, not for medicine, not for money, not for anything." "But why?" Kesa asked. And for the first time in her career, the question was not a tactic. She truly did not understand. Greg looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Because it is ours. This little corner of space, these beat-up colonies, these slow ships, they are ours. We built them, and we are not handing them over to anyone, no matter how pretty the ribbon on the box." Admiral Vicky Saunders said nothing during the entire exchange. She simply sat there, arms folded, watching the Dominion delegation with eyes that missed nothing. After the meeting, Mal returned to the Radiance of Unity and locked herself in her quarters for 6 hours. When she emerged, she ordered the Dominion intelligence team to compile a full report on human history. Every war, every revolution, every occupation and resistance. She read the entire thing in one sitting. What she found shook her. Human history was not like other species. Most civilizations the Dominion had absorbed had some tradition of resistance, but it was always small, always temporary. Humans were different. Their entire history was a cycle of empires rising and people tearing them down. Every century, on every continent, in every culture, there were humans who chose death over submission. It was not rational. It was not strategic. It was something deeper, something built into the species at a level that defied explanation. The intelligence report landed on Varentus's desk with a single note from Mal attached. It read, "They are not confused. They are not bargaining. They simply refuse to be ruled. I do not believe they can be persuaded. I recommend we reconsider our approach." Varentus read the note twice. Then he set it aside and called for Fleet Commander Orath. If generosity would not work, perhaps something else would. In Geneva, Greg Nolan sat in his office late that night, staring out the window at the fading glow of the Radiance of Unity as it left orbit. Vicky Saunders stood in the doorway behind him. "They are not going to give up," she said. "No," Greg agreed. "They are not." "Then we need to get ready." "How long do you need?" Vicky Saunders allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile. "I started the day they showed up." Part 3. The Pressure. 1 year after first contact, the Dominion of Aethera stopped being polite. It did not happen all at once. There was no announcement, no formal declaration. The pressure came quietly, like water slowly filling a room. At first, it was barely noticeable. Then, it was impossible to ignore. It started with the trade routes. Human merchant ships that had been traveling freely through unclaimed space suddenly found Dominion patrol vessels blocking their paths. The patrols never fired. They never even spoke. They simply sat in the way, massive and silent, and refused to move. Shipments that used to take 2 weeks began taking 2 months. Some never arrived at all. Then the independent species dried up. Humanity had built small but steady trade relationships with a handful of alien civilizations that lived near the edges of Dominion space. The Kessari, a peaceful insectoid species, had been trading rare minerals with the human colony on Vega 3. The Halani, a race of deep-sea dwellers, had shared water purification techniques with Earth's ocean settlements. One by one, these species went quiet. Messages went unanswered. Ships stopped coming. It did not take long to figure out why. The Dominion had leaned on them, quietly but firmly, and they had folded. Nobody wanted to anger an empire of 9,000 worlds over a friendship with a species of 12. On the colony worlds, the effects crept in slowly. Supply shipments ran late. Spare parts became scarce. On the mining colony of Harkin's Ridge, the main water recycler broke down, and the replacement parts were stuck on a freighter that had been sitting at a Dominion checkpoint for 3 weeks. Children went to bed thirsty. A few colonial governors, the cautious ones, the ones who had always calculated risk before principle, began to whisper about reconsidering the Dominion's offer. Maybe it was not so bad. Maybe a seat at the table, even a low one, was better than starving in the dark. But those whispers never grew louder, because the people would not let them. On every colony world, on every station, on Earth itself, ordinary people pushed back, not against their own government, but against the Dominion. Banners appeared on buildings and bridges. Not for sale. We kneel to no one. Our stars, our terms. Factory workers on the industrial moon of Callaway voted unanimously to double their shifts to make up for lost supplies. Farmers on the agricultural world of New Prairie planted extra crops and shipped them free of charge to the colonies that were struggling. It came from everywhere, all at once, like a heartbeat. Admiral Vicky Saunders watched all of this from her command center on Earth's orbital station. She had been preparing for this moment since the day the first Dominion fleet appeared. She was not a woman who waited for permission. She had already begun repositioning the human fleet. Every combat-capable ship was pulled back from exploration duty and reassigned to defensive positions. It was not a large fleet. 800 ships against an empire that could field hundreds of thousands. But Vicky was not planning to fight the Dominion ship for ship. She was planning to make human space into a place that no one wanted to enter. Her chief strategist was a young officer named Kyle Mercer. He was 31 years old, thin as a rail, and had a mind that worked in angles no one else could see. Kyle had spent the last 6 months designing a defensive doctrine he called the Porcupine. You could not outfight something 1,000 times your size. But you could make yourself so sharp, so painful, so costly to touch, that the thing decided you were not worth the trouble. Minefields were laid across every approach to human space. Not standard mines. Kyle had designed them to be small, cheap, and nearly invisible to sensors. They would not destroy a Dominion warship, but they would damage it, slow it down, force it to crawl when it wanted to charge. Behind the minefields came sensor grids, millions of tiny satellites that would track every ship that entered human territory and relay its position in real time. And behind those came the automated weapon platforms, unmanned stations loaded with missiles and railguns, positioned in overlapping fields of fire that would turn any invasion corridor into a killing ground. It was not enough to win a war. Kyle knew that. But it was enough to make a war very, very expensive. The Dominion sent one final diplomatic envoy. Ambassador Suri returned, but this time he was not alone. Beside him stood Fleet Commander Orath, a broad, scarred veteran of the Dominion's military who had crushed rebellions on a dozen worlds. Orath did not smile. He did not make small talk. He stood behind Suri like a shadow made of stone. They met Greg Nolan in the same conference hall in Geneva. This time, Admiral Vicky Saunders stood directly beside Greg in her full dress uniform. She wore every medal she had ever earned, and she stood with her hands clasped behind her back and her chin raised. Suri presented a revised offer. It was still generous, still filled with promises of technology and trade, but attached to the end, almost as an afterthought, was a deadline. Accept within 90 days, or the Dominion would, in Suri's careful words, reassess its approach to the human question. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. Greg Nolan listened. He did not fidget. He did not look away. When Suri finished, Greg was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was lower than before, not angry, but heavy, like a man who understood exactly what was coming and had chosen to face it anyway. We heard you the first time, Ambassador. The answer has not changed, and it will not change, not in 90 days, not in 90 years. Fleet Commander Orath said nothing during the meeting, but afterward, as the Dominion shuttle climbed back to orbit, he stood at the viewport and looked down at the planet below. Then he pulled up the intelligence files on the human defensive preparations, the minefields, the sensor grids, the weapon platforms, the fleet repositioning. He studied them for a long time. Then he turned to Suri and said, quietly, "These creatures are not bluffing. They have been preparing for war since the day we arrived." Suri looked at him. Can we defeat them? Orath did not answer immediately. He turned back to the viewport and watched the Earth grow smaller as they rose. We can defeat them, he said finally, but they will make us pay for every inch, and I am not certain the price is one the Dominion is prepared to accept. Suri closed his eyes. The deadline was already ticking. On Earth, Vicky Saunders stood in her command center, watching the Dominion shuttle leave. Kyle Mercer appeared at her side, with a datapad full of new defense calculations. 90 days, he said. Vicky took the datapad without looking at him. Then we have work to do. She did not sleep for the next 3 months. Neither did anyone else. Part 4. The Stand. The deadline passed on a Tuesday. Nothing happened on Wednesday. Nothing happened on Thursday. For 3 weeks, the galaxy held its breath, and the silence was worse than any threat. Then, the Dominion moved. 12,000 warships assembled at the border of human space. It was the largest military force the Dominion had gathered in over 2,000 years. The last time a fleet this size had been deployed, it had shattered an entire stellar federation of 40 species in 11 days. The ships stretched across the void in formations so precise they looked like equations written in steel. High Chancellor Vorentis addressed the Galactic Senate from his throne on Aethara Prime. His voice was calm, measured, almost sad. He called the operation a protective intervention. He said humanity was a young species that did not understand the dangers of standing alone in a hostile galaxy. He said the Dominion had a responsibility to bring them into the fold for their own safety. Nobody in the Senate believed him, but nobody challenged him either. 9,000 years of obedience had taught every vassal species the same lesson. Do not ask questions you do not want answered. Across human space, the news arrived like a cold wind. 12,000 ships. The number was almost beyond comprehension. Some people sat down and did not speak for hours. Some people cried. Children asked their parents what was happening, and their parents did not know what to say. But there was no panic. That was the thing that confused the Dominion intelligence officers monitoring human communications. There was no mass hysteria, no calls for surrender, no governments collapsing. Instead, there was a quiet, heavy, stubborn resolve that settled over the entire species like armor. Factories shifted to war production without being ordered to. Civilian cargo ships reported to military docking stations to be fitted with whatever weapons could be bolted to their hulls. Retired officers came out of their homes and reported for duty. On the colony world of New Prairie, a 70-year-old farmer named Pete Callahan walked into the recruitment office and told the young officer behind the desk that he had been an engineer on a destroyer 40 years ago, and he could still fix an engine faster than any kid half his age. They gave him a uniform. Admiral Vicky Saunders took command of the combined human fleet from her flagship, the Resolute Dawn. It was the largest ship humanity had ever built, and it was still smaller than a Dominion cruiser. She had 800 combat-capable vessels under her command. Some were proper warships, some were converted freighters, some were held together with welding patches and stubbornness. 800 against 12,000. Vicky looked at the numbers on her tactical display and felt the weight of them press against her chest. Then she set the feeling aside and got to work. Commodore Laura Beckett commanded the forward defense group from the bridge of the Steadfast, a fast cruiser positioned at the outer edge of the Sigma Veil Nebula. Danny Holt stood at her side as tactical officer, his face pale but steady. Megan Price coordinated the communication network that linked every human ship, station, and colony in real time. If any ship sent a message, every other ship heard it within seconds. Greg Nolan sat in his office on Earth on the night before the battle and recorded a message. It was not addressed to the Dominion. It was not addressed to humanity. It was addressed to the galaxy. He sat at a plain desk, in a plain room, wearing a plain suit. He did not pound the table. He spoke the way he always spoke, like a man who hauled cargo for a living, and had never learned to be anything other than honest. "We did not ask for this," he said. "We have harmed no one. We have taken nothing that was not ours. We refused only to kneel. If that is a crime in this galaxy, then we will accept the sentence standing. But we want every species out there to know one thing. We are not fighting because we think we can win. We are fighting because some things matter more than winning." The message was broadcast on every open frequency. It traveled across Dominion space at the speed of light, and then faster, carried by relay stations and whisper networks, and vassal species who copied it and passed it along in secret. Within 48 hours, every sentient being in the galaxy had heard it. And something shifted. 3 vassal species quietly withdrew their ships from the Dominion invasion fleet. Their governments issued bland statements about maintenance schedules and crew rotations, but everyone knew the truth. They could not bring themselves to be part of this. 2 more species opened secret back-channel communications with human diplomats, offering supplies and intelligence. They did not announce this publicly. They were not brave enough for that. Not yet. Fleet Commander Orath noticed the withdrawals, but said nothing. He had 12,000 ships. Losing a few hundred would not change the math. He gave the order to advance. The battle began at the edge of the Sigma Veil Nebula, on a cold morning by Earth's calendar, though of course, there were no mornings in space. The Dominion fleet moved forward in a broad wave, their ships advancing with the mechanical precision of an empire that had not fought a real battle in 2,000 years. They expected the humans to meet them in open space, to line up their little fleet and die bravely. Instead, Kyle Mercer's Porcupine woke up. The first wave of mines detonated across the Dominion's leading edge. They were small, barely visible, and there were millions of them. They did not destroy ships, but they tore through shields and cracked hull plating and sent dozens of vessels spinning out of formation. The perfect wave broke apart. Then the sensor grid lit up, and the automated weapon platforms opened fire from every direction. Missiles streaked out from hidden positions inside asteroid fields. Railgun rounds punched through the gaps in Dominion formations. The killing corridors that Kyle had designed months ago came alive, and the Dominion fleet walked straight into them. The human fleet hit them from the flanks. Laura Beckett led the forward group in fast slashing attacks, darting in from the nebula's edge, firing everything they had, and pulling back before the Dominion's heavier ships could turn their guns. Danny Holt called out targets with a voice that shook, but never stopped. Megan Price kept the communication net alive through jamming and interference that would have blinded any other fleet. The Dominion adapted. They were not fools. Orath pulled his fleet into tighter formations, concentrated his fire, and began grinding forward through the minefields and weapon platforms by sheer force. Human ships began to die. The converted freighter Callaway's Pride took a direct hit and broke apart. The destroyer Bright Morning lost its engines and drifted into the crossfire. One by one, the smaller ships winked out on Vicky Saunders's tactical display, like candles blown out by a wind. The battle lasted 9 hours. When it was over, humanity had lost nearly half its fleet. 371 ships destroyed. Thousands dead. Laura Beckett's own ship had taken heavy damage. She had a gash across her forehead that she had not bothered to treat because there was no time. But the Dominion had lost over 1,000 ships. 1,000 warships, destroyed by a species they had expected to fold in hours. It was a number that meant nothing in terms of the Dominion's total military strength. But it meant everything in terms of what the galaxy believed was possible. Fleet Commander Orath sat on the bridge of his command ship and stared at the casualty reports. His hands were steady, but his eyes were not. He had fought in a dozen campaigns. He had never lost 1,000 ships in a single engagement. he had never lost 100. He requested new orders from Athera Prime. On Athera Prime, High Chancellor Vorentis received the report in his private chambers. He read it once, he read it twice. Then he set it down and stared at the wall. His chief advisor asked him what he wanted to do. Vorentis did not answer. For the first time in 300 years, the most powerful being in the galaxy did not know. Part 5, The Reckoning. 2 weeks after the Battle of the Sigma Veil, the Dominion fleet still sat at the edge of human space. It did not advance. It did not retreat. It just hung there, 12,000 ships minus the ones that were never coming back, waiting for an order that did not come. Behind the battle lines, the Dominion was cracking. The first cracks were small. 3 vassal species that had already pulled their ships from the invasion fleet now filed formal protests with the Galactic Senate. Their statements were careful, diplomatic, full of the kind of polite language that empires use to say dangerous things without getting punished. But the meaning was clear. They did not support the war. More importantly, they were no longer afraid to say so. Then 2 more species went further. The Kasari, the same insectoid civilization that had once traded minerals with the human colony on Vega 3, opened a direct communication channel with Earth. They offered food shipments. The Halami, the deep-sea dwellers, sent a coded message to Admiral Vicky Saunders containing detailed maps of Dominion fleet positioning. They asked that their name not be mentioned. They were not ready to stand up, but they were ready to help someone who was. On Athera Prime, the Galactic Senate was in an uproar that it tried very hard to disguise as calm debate. Senators from a dozen vassal species demanded to know why the Dominion had committed its largest fleet in 2,000 years against a species of 12 star systems. The official answer, protective intervention, had stopped convincing anyone. The real question, the one that no one dared ask out loud but everyone was thinking, was much simpler. If the Dominion needed 12,000 ships to deal with a species this small, what did that say about the Dominion? High Chancellor Vorentis felt the ground shifting beneath him. He had ruled for 300 years by understanding one simple truth. An empire survives not because of its strength, but because of the belief in its strength. The moment that belief cracked, everything cracked with it. His advisors were split down the middle. The military faction, led by officers loyal to Fleet Commander Orath, demanded a full assault. Crush the humans, burn their colonies, make an example so terrible that no vassal species would ever dream of defiance again. It was the old solution, the one that had always worked. The diplomatic faction said the opposite. Pull back, absorb the loss, pretend it was a show of mercy. The humans were too small to matter. Let them have their little corner of space and hope the galaxy forgot about it. And then there was Kessa Mall. Kessa had changed since her first visit to Earth. She had spent months studying humanity, reading their history, watching their broadcasts, trying to understand a species that chose hardship over comfort, simply because the comfort came with chains. She had started as a diplomat, trying to solve a problem. She had become something closer to a witness. She requested a private audience with Vorentis. He granted it, because even now, he respected her mind. She stood before him in his chambers, smaller than him by half, and spoke without any of the careful diplomatic language she had used her entire career. High Chancellor, she said, the humans have shown us something we have been hiding from ourselves for 9,000 years. This empire was not built on loyalty. It was built on the fact that no one ever had the courage to say no. Now someone has, and if we destroy them for it, we prove to every vassal species that the Dominion holds power only through violence. That is not a truth this empire can survive. Vorentis looked at her for a long time. And if we withdraw, what message does that send? That we are strong enough to respect strength in others, Kessa said. That is a message the galaxy can live with. The alternative is one it cannot. On the other side of the battle lines, Admiral Vicky Saunders was not sleeping. She had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch since the battle. The human fleet was in bad shape. Of the 429 ships that survived, nearly half were damaged. Shipyards on every colony ran day and night. Workers who had never touched a warship were learning to weld hull plating. It was not enough. If the Dominion attacked again with full force, the math was simple and final. Commodore Laura Beckett commanded the forward watch from a ship that was held together with emergency patches and the sheer unwillingness of its crew to stop. Danny Holt had not left the bridge in 40 hours. Megan Price's communication net was the only thing keeping the scattered fleet coordinated. They were exhausted, wounded, and outgunned, and not one of them had talked about surrender. Not once. Not even as a joke. Then something unexpected happened. Greg Nolan received a private communication from Ambassador Suri. It was not sent through official channels. It carried no Dominion seal. It was a personal message, almost a plea. Suri asked for a meeting. Alone. No guards, no aides, no recorders. Greg agreed. They met on a small neutral station near the edge of the Sigma Vale, a trading post that had been abandoned when the blockade began. The two of them sat across from each other in a dusty room with flickering lights. Suri looked different. The polished diplomat who had arrived with 2,000 gleaming ships was gone. In his place was someone older, smaller, worn down by something heavier than fatigue. He asked Greg a single question. Why? You could have had everything we offered. Technology, medicine, safety, a seat among the greatest civilizations in the galaxy. Why would you choose this? Why would you choose war and death and suffering when paradise was right there in front of you? Greg did not answer right away. He sat in that dusty room and thought about it, really thought about it, as if he owed this alien an honest answer. And maybe he did. Because everything you offered came with a leash, Greg said finally. And we would rather build our own future with our own hands, even if it is smaller, even if it is harder, even if it hurts, than live in someone else's idea of paradise. That is not logic, Ambassador. That is just who we are. Suri sat with those words for a long time. Then he nodded slowly and stood up. He returned to the Dominion fleet and requested an audience with High Chancellor Varentis. When it was granted, he delivered his recommendation in a voice that was steady and clear and carried no room for argument. Withdraw. Not because we cannot defeat them. We can. But because defeating them will cost us something no victory can replace. Every vassal species is watching. If we crush a people whose only crime was refusing to kneel, we will hold the galaxy by fear alone. And fear, High Chancellor, has an expiration date. Varentis sat in silence for a very long time. His advisors waited. Fleet Commander Orath waited. The Senate waited. The galaxy waited. Then, Varentis gave the order. The Dominion fleet turned around. There was no treaty, no terms, no agreements, no handshake. The ships simply powered up their drives and left. 12,000 warships folding back into hyperspace, one formation at a time, until the border of human space was empty again. On the bridge of the Resolute Dawn, Vicky Saunders watched the last Dominion signatures disappear from her sensors. She stood there for a full minute without moving. Then she sat down in her chair and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for a year. "It is over," Danny Holt said from the communication relay, and his voice cracked when he said it. "No," Vicky said quietly. "It is not over, but today is not the day we fall." 1 year later, human space was still scarred. The Sigma Vale was littered with wreckage that would take decades to clear. Colony worlds still bore the marks of rationing and hardship. The fleet was rebuilding, slowly, one ship at a time. But it was rebuilding. New ships came off the lines every month. Colonies that had struggled through the blockade were back on their feet. The Kessari had resumed trade openly. The Helani had sent their first official ambassador to Earth. And across the galaxy, in the quiet corners of Dominion space, something was happening that Vorentis had feared more than any fleet. Other species were asking questions. Species that had accepted vassalage centuries ago. Species that had bowed their heads and taken the leash and told themselves it was the smart thing to do, were looking at humanity and whispering to each other in the dark. The question was always the same, and it spread like fire through dry grass. What if we had said no? Nobody had the answer yet, but the fact that they were asking was enough. On a cool evening, Commodore Laura Beckett stood on the bridge of her new ship, a fast cruiser fresh off the line, still smelling of welding flux and new paint. She looked out the forward viewport at the stars stretching away in every direction, bright and cold and endless. Danny Holt walked up beside her. He was older now, a little thinner, with a scar on his jaw from a piece of shrapnel that had nearly taken his head off during the battle. He looked out at the same stars and was quiet for a while. "Do you think they will come back?" he asked. Laura smiled, just slightly, just at the corner of her mouth. "Maybe," she said, "but now they know the price." She stood there for a while longer, looking at the stars that belonged to no one and everyone, and behind her, the ship hummed with the quiet, steady sound of a species that had been knocked down and gotten back up, the way it always had, the way it always would. The galaxy was vast and old, and full of empires that had risen and fallen like waves on a shore. But somewhere in a small, stubborn corner of the Orion Spur, a species of short-lived, fragile, impossibly stubborn creatures had done something that no one believed was possible. They had said no, and they had meant it, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be quite the same again. Galactic empires shocked, as humans refuse every attempt at diplomacy. Part 1. The Arrival. In the year 2387, humanity had spread across 12 star systems. They had built colonies on dusty moons and frozen planets. They had learned to survive in places where nothing was meant to live. But in all those years of reaching into the dark, they had never found anyone else out there. They believed they were alone. They were wrong. Far beyond the edge of human space, the dominion of Aethara had ruled the galaxy for 9,000 years. It was an empire so vast that most species could not even name all the worlds it controlled. Over 9,000 planets answered to the High Chancellor, and every single one of them had joined the same way. A fleet would arrive, an offer would be made, and the species would accept. It had always worked, without exception. High Chancellor Vorentis sat in his council chamber on the capital world of Aethera Prime, when the first reports about humanity reached his desk. His intelligence officers had detected a new species expanding through the Orion Spur. They were primitive by Dominion standards. Their ships were slow. Their weapons were basic. Their territory was tiny. But they were growing fast, and Vorentis had not held power for 300 years by ignoring small problems before they became large ones. He summoned Ambassador Talon Suori, the finest diplomat the Dominion had ever produced. Suori had personally brought over 300 species into the fold. He was patient, elegant, and absolutely certain of himself. Vorentis gave him a simple task. Go to the humans. Make the offer. Bring them in. Suori assembled an envoy fleet of 2,000 ships. It was not a war fleet, but it was meant to impress. The ships were polished and enormous, each one gleaming like a silver blade against the black of space. They jumped through hyperspace and arrived at the edge of human territory in a perfect formation that stretched across half a light year. The first human vessel they encountered was the Starbound Vigil, a deep space exploration ship running survey missions in an unclaimed system. It was not a warship. It carried a crew of 94 people, and it was roughly the size of one of the Dominion's shuttle bays. Captain Laura Beckett was on the bridge when the alarms went off. She was a tall woman with short brown hair and steady hands, the kind of person who never raised her voice because she never needed to. Her first officer, Danny Holt, nearly choked on his coffee when the sensor screen filled with contacts. Thousands of them. "What in the world is that?" Danny said, staring at the display. Megan Price, the chief communications officer, answered before Laura could. "They are hailing us, Captain, on every frequency we have, and a few we do not." Laura straightened in her chair. "Put it through." The main screen flickered, and the image of Ambassador Suri appeared. He was tall and thin, with pale blue skin, and 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on his face. He wore robes of deep gold, and he spoke with a voice that was smooth and practiced. "Greetings, people of Earth," Suri began. "I am Ambassador Talon Suri, voice of the Dominion of Aethara. We come to you in peace and friendship. We have watched your growth with admiration, and we wish to offer you a place among the great family of civilizations that make up our empire." He went on for nearly 20 minutes. He described the benefits of joining the Dominion: access to trade routes that spanned the galaxy, medical technology that could extend human life by centuries, agricultural science that could end hunger on every colony world. All humanity had to do was accept the authority of the High Chancellor and take its place as a vassal species within the Dominion structure. It was, by any measure, a generous offer. Every species that had heard it before had wept with gratitude. Laura listened to every word. She did not interrupt. She did not ask questions. When Suri finished, there was a long silence on the bridge of the Starborn Vigil. Danny Holt looked at her. Megan Price looked at her. The entire crew waited. Laura leaned forward slightly and said, "We appreciate your visit, Ambassador, but we will have to decline." The silence that followed was not just on the Starborn Vigil. It stretched across the entire envoy fleet. 2,000 ships, crewed by tens of thousands of Dominion officers, and not a single one of them made a sound. Suri blinked all 4 of his eyes, one pair at a time. "I am sorry, Captain. Could you repeat that?" "We are grateful for the offer," Laura said, her voice calm and even. "But humanity is not interested in joining your empire. We wish you well, and we hope we can be good neighbors. But the answer is no." Suri stared at her. He opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. In 300 successful negotiations, he had never needed a backup plan for this moment, because this moment had never happened before. "Captain," he said carefully, "I do not think you understand the full scope of what we are offering." "I understood it just fine," Laura said. "The answer is still no." Danny Holt, following protocol, transmitted the formal human response to the envoy fleet. Within 6 hours, every colonial governor in the human network had co-signed it. 12 star systems, 47 colonies, and roughly 11 billion human beings, all saying the same thing: no. Ambassador Suri returned to Aethara Prime in a state of visible confusion. He stood before High Chancellor Vorentis in the Great Council Chamber and delivered his report. His voice, usually so smooth and confident, was halting and uncertain. "They refused," he said. Vorentis leaned forward on his throne. "They attempted to negotiate for better terms?" "No, High Chancellor. They did not negotiate. They did not counteroffer. They simply said no." Vorentis was quiet for a very long time. His advisors shifted nervously around him. In 9,000 years of expansion, across tens of thousands of species and countless civilizations, the Dominion of Aethara had never once been told no. "Interesting," Vorentis said, at last. "And that single word carried more weight than any declaration of war. Somewhere in the Orion Spur, Captain Laura Beckett sat in the small mess hall of the Starbourne Vigil, eating a bowl of soup. Danny Holt sat across from her, still looking shaken. "Do you think they will come back?" he asked. Laura took another spoonful of soup. "Probably." "What do we do then?" he asked. She looked at him and shrugged, just slightly. "We say no again." And for the first time in 9,000 years, the galaxy had a species that meant it.